Welcome to Victoria 3's Big Update Day, where Paradox Interactive are breaking down 5 categories of the game, revisiting their roadmap that they released last year, updating it with both new information, ticking off some of the things they've already done, and expanding on some more features that think they need a little more work. Let's jump straight in. Reading from left to right, let's start with the military. Now, of course, there are 4 categories here, and the done category, as is pretty self-explanatory, is already out of the way. They've added strategic objectives, the ability for countries to set them, and addressed some of the rough edges around how units, generals, and battles function as a whole. Next category, updated, things that they've tweaked but not yet completed. They'd like to improve the ability of players to get an overview of the military situation with more data, like the underlying numbers behind battles. They say that they've made some improvements to this already in 1.2, added breakdowns for certain factors, but they have more work to do when it comes to giving us a better overview of wars and making those niggly multi-front wars a little easier to manage. They've also talked about wanting to increase the visibility of navies, making admirals easier to work with. Again, some improvements already made, but they still consider navies to be an area of the game in need of improvement for both visibility and usability. And I couldn't agree more, although I do get off some pretty nice naval invasions in this gameplay you're watching. And the last thing that they'd like to keep working on is to find solutions for the issue where theatres can split into multiple dozens of tiny fronts and pockets are created. They mitigated it a little bit in 1.2 by auto-closing those small pockets, but further improvements are needed. Now we get into the detail about the juicy stuff, either the things that they haven't quite tackled yet, but already told us they wanted to do, the not updateds, or brand new information. The not updated is around experimenting with controlled front splitting on those really large fronts. Can I break this down into multiple fronts to manage it easier? They say that some internal design work has already been done, but it's tricky to get right without worsening already existing issues. They go on to say, though, that it's a very high priority for them nonetheless. And now we have 2 new changes. The first is that they'd like to add a system for limiting the number of wars in the early game between great powers, these sort of ginormous total wars that suck everybody in, and indeed in this gameplay I'm kind of guilty of doing that myself. And then the second new thing for military is that they'd like to solve the issue of armies just packing up and going home after generals die during a war. Like, can you imagine the general, and they're all just like, oh, what do we do? And they flee. I mean, you know, fair enough, but they'd like to fix this by adding a system for field promotions so that hopefully somebody else with a few brain cells can step up to the task. And that rounds out the changes coming for 1.3 and 1.4, i.e. the future of Victoria 3 in the sort of immediate to midterm. Let's move on now to talk about historical immersion. We'll start by talking quickly about what they've already done. They've ensured that the American Civil War has a decent chance of happening, and happens in a way that makes sense and isn't as easily avoidable by the player. The ACW is now more difficult to avoid, and when sparked over the issue of slavery, should now create a historically plausible CSA. They've also already worked to expose and improve content such as expeditions and journal entries that's currently just too difficult for players to find or complete. Moving on to the things that they actually want to change, though. This one is a little bit lighter on the actual brand new or not updated stuff, but the updated has some detail. They talk about how tweaking content such as the Meiji restoration, Alaskan purchase, and so on, in a way that they can more frequently be successfully performed by the AI, our opponent, through a mix of AI improvements and content tweaks. They say that significant improvements have already been made to the AI's ability to complete journal entries, like Manifest Destiny for example, but it still struggles with ones like the Meiji restoration, so further work will be needed. The second point is that they want to ensure that those unifications, right, bringing these nations together, I think Italy, Germany, and Canada, they want to make sure that that doesn't constantly happen decades ahead of the historical schedule, and increasing the challenge of unifying Italy and Germany in particular is in their line of sight. They go on to say that the unifications now occur in a way that is more sort of on schedule with history, but they still want to change it so that they mechanically behave in a slightly more plausible way, i.e. how these things actually play out in-game should mimic history a little bit better. And then the final point that they add here on things that they want to keep working on are those general AI tweaks to have AI countries play in a more believable and immersive way. They have genuinely already made pretty good progress on this, at least in my playthroughs and in my opinion, particularly in patch 1.2. That one was really great. But they're going to continue giving it extra attention, especially when it comes to making the AI less opaque in its reasoning. The example that they give is explaining why they sided against you in a diplomatic play, despite having really good relations with them. So there's still some things to tweak. Before we move to having one of our classic AI artwork breaks, I've got a doozy for you today. There is one new element that's been added to the roadmap. They'd like to begin adding more country, state, and region-specific content to enhance historical flavor of different countries. This is a small bullet point, but potentially has a really profound impact. This is that historical immersion, that storytelling, and also, crucially, a way of making the nations in Victoria 3 feel different from one another. It's crucial, I think, that we have more diversity of play between nations, and this is especially one way that they could achieve that. But now I'd like you to just take a step back, a breath of fresh air. Here's our AI artwork break today, and the prompt, believe it or not, was a person staring at a giant pile of books with a thought bubble over their head, thinking about Queen Victoria. For some reason, she looks like a dolphin. On to diplomacy, which actually ties in really nicely with our previous points. It's as if they've planned it. What they've already done, in a nutshell, can be summarized by the fact that now in our diplomatic plays, we're not just stuck with having one primary demand. We can force as much as we like on the opponent so long as we have the infamy to handle it. Now, on to the things that they've updated but not yet fully finished with. Firstly, reverse swaying. They'd like to add the ability to offer to join a side in a play in exchange for something. So instead of the player having to try and grab friends, hey France, do you want to join this fight? I'll give you a port. Now it could go both ways. France could say, hey, Austria, I'd love to join that fight. Give me a port. Nice. Secondly, they'll have more things to offer in diplomatic plays, like giving away some of your own land as support. I love that. That's very fun. I'd like to see that. Thirdly, trading, or at least giving away states. So tying into that again, it doesn't just have to be through diplomatic plays, but maybe you and I can come to a deal about Alaska after all. The fourth point is about foreign investment and some form of construction in other countries. At least if they're part of our market. The saying of at least there potentially leaves the door open for even more, but it would be nice to be able to invest directly into other markets, and there's already a mod that does a great job at doing that for the most part. And the final point that they'd like to work on that hasn't yet been updated is improving and expanding on interactions with and from our subjects, such as being able to grant and ask for more autonomy through diplomatic actions. Again, we've seen a little bit of this, like many things in the modding community, and honestly, a great flavoured touch. Finally, there is one new thing added to the diplomacy list. Brand new feature for 1.3 or 1.4, and that's that they'd like to allow peace deals to be negotiated during a diplomatic play, instead of only having the option to either give in, or of course they don't mention it here, but the other option is to go to war instead of peace. An interesting take, and this would allow a lot of different options. It also could benefit the fact that there's this, sort of great war, great power problem where they're all diving on top of each other. So some of these features could bleed in and connect together very well. In honestly a fairly light category, we have the newly internal politics. Here a point was moved from the smorgasbord of other and into this position. What they'd like to do is make it more interesting and competitive, but also more challenging to play in a more either conservative or autocratic style. So as we go out towards the edges of the political spectrum, it wants to be both more interesting but also more competitive. The devil in the detail here is they say that they've already made some changes, locking laws behind regressive distributions of power and changing GDP to not unfairly favour manufacturing economies, but this is an area that they still want to do more work in. Another way to potentially diversify states as well. We have some new features added to internal politics though, and 3 of them, in fact. Firstly, they'd like to improve the mechanics of law enactment and revolutions to be more engaging for the player to interact with. A great idea, especially around those revolutions. I think they're a little bit of a sticking point. Secondly, they want to add more mechanics for characters and give the player more reason to actually care about individual characters in their country. They go on to expand on this point with the third one by saying that they'd like to add laws that expand on diversity of countries and introduce new ways to play the game. And that, my friends, is what we were talking about earlier in the video. More diversification between nations so that they play differently. And internal politics is a way that really hasn't been touched. I mean, sure, when you start the game, there's a political party in power and it's historically accurate or what have you to the nation at the time. But, you know, give it 10 or 20 years and you can do anything. So it would also be nice, potentially, if there were some barriers or boosters to help or hinder that, depending on the nation that you're playing. And finally, what happens if all the forgotten middle children come together and form a category? It's other. Let's take a look. So there are three things here, main things that they've already done. They've made it easier for us to get an overview of our population and their needs, their standard of living. We've got new maps to get there, as well as new user interface tools. Secondly, they experimented with the autonomous private sector, right? This was the big part of patch 1.2, increasing differences in gameplay between the economic systems as well. And then thirdly, in the other category, they've ironed out some of the kinks with late game economy and the AI's ability to develop key resources like oil and rubber. While the economic AI is definitely going to receive improvements, the specific issue of the AI never developing those resources should now be fixed. And last but not least, before we get to the sort of wrap up, when is this going to release, how should we expect it, there is one final new point in Other. They'd like to improve alerts and the current situation widget to provide more useful and actionable information. I think that's always a good thing because we do sort of sometimes rely on these alerts and these widgets, particularly if something may have slipped through your fingers and you're not paying close enough attention. And so, to conclude, they issue a few caveats here. Firstly, while this is a sort of a broad kind of roadmap style overview, it is not, of course, an exhaustive list. And if you've seen any of my patch note videos before, you'll know that there's usually tens of bullet points that follow on from these main ideas. But I personally think that this gives us a great idea about what they're focusing on and sort of everything at a high level that we should expect. They go on to say that they can't give any exact timelines for any of the individual points or precise future dates of the update that they'll be part of. This list still only covers changes and additions, and this is important, that will be part of the free updates. So all of this will roll out for free to anybody who owns Victoria 3. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this week's update. They hope that we found it informative. I certainly did. Next week, they'll be diving back into regular dev diaries after taking a little bit of a break, where we'll get more information about update 1.3 itself. Thank you very much for joining me on a pretty exciting day for Victoria 3. I'll see you next time.